Welcome to Medieval History Channel 97, where the echoes of the past come alive. Step into the world of knights, castles, and forgotten legends as we journey through time together. Let history speak. Imagine this. You're walking along a dirt path, your feet sinking into thick, wet mud. The sun has long vanished, swallowed by low gray clouds that promise another night of bone-deep cold. Your clothes are soaked, your body aches, your coin pouch is light. And ahead, faint through the mist, you see a flickering light and smell something that's hard to describe. A mix of wood smoke, sour ale, and the unmistakable staleness of too many people packed too tightly for too long. This isn't the start of a fantasy novel. This was real. This was medieval England. And that distant, dimly lit structure, that was your best hope, the inn. But don't let the warm light fool you. Behind those doors were no promises of comfort or safety. Only the chance to rest your weary body in a corner if space allowed, and maybe fill your belly with something vaguely edible. What you gained in shelter, you might pay for in coin, dignity, or even personal safety. The medieval inn wasn't a place of leisure, it was a place of survival. Today we peel back the layers of time, not to romanticize the past, but to face it, raw and honest. To see what life was truly like for the traveler, the merchant, the pilgrim, or the soldier who dared venture across a brutal landscape carved by war, hunger, and merciless weather. This is not just history. This is human endurance at its most elemental. The world back then was unforgiving. Roads were not roads but rutted trails, easily turned to rivers of sludge with the slightest rainfall. A journey that might take an hour today could stretch across several grueling, uncertain days, every mile bringing new threats. Wild animals, roving thieves, and the ever-present risk of falling ill with no hope of help. And so the inn, however crude, however dangerous, became a lifeline. A merchant burdened with cargo and constant worry might crawl through its doors not for warmth, but for the simple, desperate hope that both he and his goods would see the next morning. The beds, if there were any, were shared, the air thick with smoke, sweat, and secrets. Privacy didn't exist, nor did trust. Every glance was calculated, every stranger a potential thief or worse. And yet, the inn was necessary. It offered a fragile line of defense between a traveler and the vast, hostile unknown. In today's world of paved roads, GPS, and heated hotel rooms, it's almost impossible to imagine. But for those who lived it, the inn was not a luxury. It was a test of resilience, a checkpoint in the long, exhausting battle to simply keep going. So as we step into this forgotten world, let's do more than just observe. Let's feel it. The cold, the fear, the grit, the sheer will to survive. Because sometimes the past doesn't just teach us, it humbles us, and it reminds us how deeply human it is to keep moving forward. Even when the path is hard, the night is long, and hope flickers like a distant candle in the dark. For the soldier, weary and battle-worn, racing toward the rendezvous point of his squad, or trudging home from the unforgiving fields of war, the sight of an inn wasn't just a welcome stop, it was salvation. It was the promise of a hot meal, however humble, and a brief escape into a mug of coarse ale, strong enough to dull the ache in his bones and the memories in his mind. In that fleeting moment, beneath a smoke-darkened roof, he could let his guard down, if only for a night. For the pilgrim, with calloused feet and a heart full of prayers, walking toward distant sacred shrines, the inn was a temporary haven, a quiet space to rest his body and rekindle his spiritual resolve. It gave him the strength to keep going, to follow the pull of faith beyond what his flesh could endure. He wasn't seeking comfort, only the shelter needed to continue his holy journey. Even the simple peasant, whose life revolved around the rhythms of soil and harvest, would see the inn as more than a place to sleep. On his way to the fair in a neighboring town, a rare and hopeful break from his routine, he would find in that humble shelter a sense of security. It was his only protection from the long shadows of the forest and the dangers that roamed freely after dark. Without these scattered islands of fragile civilization, posted like waypoints along the dusty and unforgiving roads, large swathes of land would have remained remote, wild, and nearly impassable. The inns were more than just businesses, they were lifelines. The ruling authorities of the time, despite their flaws and frequent inefficiencies, understood this. Trade had to flow, messengers had to move, armies had to march, And so edicts and local laws were passed, requiring feudal lords and village communities to maintain roads and bridges, not out of generosity, but necessity. Inns, called inns for the wealthier travelers, or alehouses for those with fewer coins in their pouch, were woven naturally into this infrastructure. They were the unsung heroes of medieval mobility, offering food, rest, warmth, and sometimes even news from the road. They bridged the gap between survival and danger, between isolation and human connection. A full day's journey in those times rarely exceeded 20 to 30 miles, often less if the roads were muddy or treacherous. By sunset, every traveler, be he nobleman or commoner, merchant or mercenary, would press on with the last of his strength, desperate to reach the safety of shelter. To remain out on the open road after nightfall was not merely unwise, it was reckless. The night belonged to wolves and men more dangerous than wolves. So imagine, after hours of hardship and vigilance, our medieval traveler finally glimpses the dim outline of a building against the dusk. Relief floods his chest, but what awaits him? Not the glowing, timbered inn of modern fantasy, with lanterns twinkling at the windows and a cheerful innkeeper waiting at the door. No. More likely, it was a squat and weathered structure, low-roofed and lopsided, cobbled together with timber, mud, or whatever materials the land and time could spare. Smoke curled uncertainly from the chimney. The yard was muddy, the animals restless. But still, it was shelter. It was fire. It was the possibility of warmth, of bread, of human voices in the night. And that, in a world as wild and weary as the one he walked, was enough. In the shadow of forests, inns were built from timber hewn straight from the surrounding woods. Elsewhere, they stood as rough shelters, shanties patched together with wild stone, or walls of sun-dried clay, thickened with straw and animal dung to give them just enough strength to endure the seasons. These buildings were not crafted for comfort, but for survival. Windows, if they existed at all, were little more than slits, narrow, crooked gashes in the wall that barely admitted the dimmest daylight and almost no fresh air. Glass was a rare luxury, unaffordable to most. Instead, these openings were covered with whatever was at hand. Oiled cloth that fluttered in the wind, sheets dyed with ox blood, or crude wooden shutters slammed shut against the cold. From the rooftops, whether thatched or tiled, blue smoke would rise in lazy spirals, not from tidy chimneys, but often from holes punched straight through the roof. The smoke drifted upward as if reluctant to leave, a sign that inside, fires still fought the darkness. If an inn bore a sign at all, it was stark and primitive, meant to speak to a world where reading was a rare privilege. A simple bunch of ivy, some hops, or a pine branch might hang above the door, echoing symbols from ancient Roman taverns that had once done the same. Sometimes there would be a crude painting, a barrel, a tankard, a boar's head, rough sketches that spoke of ale, meat, and momentary refuge. But the space around the building betrayed a harsher truth. There was no clean path to the door. The ground was a mixture of mud, rotting food, spilled ale, and human waste. Scraps were hurled against the walls, left to rot or be devoured by pigs and feral dogs that scavenged nearby. Horse manure left uncollected, mixed with dirt and rain, coating the earth in a foul-smelling paste. The air rang with noise, sharp, chaotic, and constant. From within the tavern came bursts of drunken laughter, angry shouting, broken songs sung off key and with too much force. Outside, dogs barked at passing strangers, horses whinnied from exhaustion, and doors creaked and groaned on rusted hinges. It was not a place of peace, it was a place of warning. A medieval inn offered no illusion of comfort. It was a place to survive the storm, to escape the wind and the cold. But not without risk. You entered with your guard up, you kept your coin close and your trust even closer, because in this dim corner of the world, danger wasn't hidden. It was part of the very structure. And yet, people came, because no matter how crude, how dirty, how threatening, it was a flicker of warmth in a cold and unpredictable world. Taverns were not just buildings, they were reflections of the world that birthed them. Chaotic, dirty, dangerous, and alive. And in an era where sanitation was almost non-existent, they stood as breeding grounds for both human connection and human illness. Disease, like song, passed easily from one body to the next. But so did stories and warmth and moments of fierce, fleeting humanity. When the weary traveler stepped over the high, time-worn threshold of the inn, he wasn't just entering a building, he was crossing into another world. one that pulsed with life, survival, and stories untold. This main room, simple in appearance yet rich in character, was truly the heart and soul of the inn. It was the place where warmth was kindled on cold nights, where bread was broken among strangers, and where tales were shared by firelight. But it wasn't a gentle welcome that greeted him. It was a thick, acrid wall of smoke that stung the eyes and clawed at the throat, a suffocating presence hanging low beneath the heavy beams of the ceiling like a ghost that refused to leave. At the center of the room stood the hearth, a crude but vital structure often built right into the middle of the stone or packed earth floor. It was the inn's lifeline, its core, serving as both stove and furnace, providing warmth to the chilled bones of travelers and cooking whatever meager food the establishment could offer. In many such inns, there was no chimney in the proper sense. The smoke, thick and stubborn, had no direct route of escape. It rose, lingered, then sluggishly found its way out through a hole carved into the roof or slipped through countless gaps in the weathered wooden walls. Sometimes it didn't escape at all. It merely stayed, embedding itself into every fiber of the place. Everything inside bore the mark of smoke's long reign. The darkened rafters above were coated with a greasy film of soot, as were the rough walls and the few humble furnishings. A permanent scent of scorched wood and old fat lingered, clinging to hair and clothes, becoming part of the traveler whether he wished it or not. The light within the room was barely enough to see by. Illumination came reluctantly, if at all. Tallow candles, made from hardened animal fat, sputtered in shallow holders or stuck directly into the wooden tables. They smoked as much as they burned, emitting a rancid odor and casting dim, flickering shadows that danced like spirits across the walls. More commonly, light was provided by slivers of dry wood, lamp sticks, wedged into crude holders or clutched in calloused hands. These burned fast, spat sparks, and filled the air with yet more smoke. They illuminated little and endangered much, for a careless drop could set the place ablaze. In this murky twilight where smoke blurred vision and shadows clung to every corner, the room's contents took shape only gradually. Rough-hewn tables, massive and worn smooth by years of elbows and tankards, stood like forgotten sentinels. Primitive benches lined their sides, creaking under the weight of those who sat, their surfaces scarred with the names, crude drawings, and passing words of those who had come before. Nothing here was new. Everything bore the memory of time. Every gouge, every stain, every burn told a silent story. The floor beneath was equally unforgiving. In many inns, it was nothing more than earth, packed down by centuries of feet until it was nearly as hard as stone. In finer establishments, there might have been wooden planks, but these too were rarely cleaned, their gaps filled with dirt, food scraps, and stale drink. The entire floor was a mosaic of grime and memory. Straw, reeds, or dried leaves were scattered over it, not only for insulation or comfort, but to absorb whatever filth fell from above. Spilled ale, human spit, drops of stew, even worse. It was a practical solution, but not a clean one. The result was a floor that crunched underfoot, that smelled of damp rot and old food, that held onto every scent and stain like a record of all who had passed through. And yet, in this rough and rugged space, dimly lit, choked with smoke, layered with soot and memory, there was a kind of raw honesty. It was not beauty in the conventional sense, but something deeper, a place carved out of necessity and endurance, a shelter, however humble, from the harshness of the outside world, a place where stories began, where endings were mourned, and where life, no matter how messy, continued. In practice, however, this bedding was changed very rarely, perhaps once every few weeks, or even just a handful of times throughout the year. What began as simple, straw-stuffed sacks or rough fabric coverings eventually transformed into a living, breathing ecosystem of filth. It became a true breeding ground for fleas, lice, bedbugs, and a host of other unwelcome vermin. These creatures thrived in the warm, damp environment, feasting on human skin and blood while leaving behind their own unpleasant traces. Over time, the bedding absorbed the sweat of countless bodies, the stale remnants of late-night feasts, the splatter of spilled ale, vomit from overindulgent guests, and even blood from drunken brawls. Each layer told a story, though none you'd want to hear while trying to fall asleep. Animals roamed freely in the common areas of many inns, turning the space into a chaotic blend of human and livestock life. Chickens clucked around under tables, pecking at dropped crumbs, and pigs sometimes trotted through, snorting and rooting around for scraps of food. This was not considered unusual, it was part of daily life. But for modern sensibilities, the very thought is shocking. Hygiene, as we understand it today, was nearly non-existent. And the smells, oh, the smells! They were unforgettable, overwhelming, and all-consuming. It was a pungent symphony, a constantly shifting medley of human and animal odors that could easily knock a visitor off their feet. The ever-present scent of smoke and soot clung to everything, blending with the sour tang of spoiled or newly fermented ale. The heavy, musky stench of unwashed bodies, dozens of them packed into close quarters, hovered in the air. Add to that the acrid whiff of burnt or rotten food, the wet dog odor of animals seeking warmth, and other unidentifiable but deeply offensive smells, and you had a sensory experience not easily forgotten. The typical layout of a medieval inn was practical, but crude. There was usually one large common room that served multiple purposes: dining hall, drinking space, gossip center, and sleeping area. Social class didn't mean much here. Everyone shared the same cramped space. The kitchen, if it could be called that, was often nothing more than a hearth in the corner, with a few battered pots and pans hanging nearby. Cooking was a rough art, and meals were prepared under primitive, unsanitary conditions. A few private rooms or small cubbyholes might exist for sleeping, but even those offered little privacy or comfort. Most travelers found rest where they could, on benches beside the hearth or curled in corners, wrapped in their cloaks if they had one, and praying for warmth and safety through the night. As for drink, ale was king, virtually the only beverage served in most English inns of the period. But don't let modern images of clear, bubbly, golden beer deceive you. Medieval ale was something altogether different. It was thick, cloudy, unfiltered, and made without hops. Brewed from barley or wheat malt, water, and wild yeast, it lacked the sharp bitterness and flavor we associate with today's beer. Hops wouldn't become common in England until centuries later, imported from the European continent. This ale was often sweet and surprisingly filling, which earned it the nickname liquid bread. In many cases, it was a vital source of calories and nutrients, especially for those unable to afford solid food. But the quality of the ale varied wildly, from one inn to another and even from one cask to the next. Everything depended on the brewer's skill, usually the innkeeper's wife, the freshness of the ingredients, and the storage conditions. More often than not, the ale was either too young and raw or old, sour, and spoiling. In their quest for profit, innkeepers were known to cut corners. Ale was frequently watered down, brewed from low quality or even spoiled grain, and sometimes infused with strange and questionable ingredients meant to mask its faults or increase its strength. For the weary traveler, every sip was a gamble, one that could offer temporary relief or lead straight to a long night of sickness. Drinking such ale was not merely an unpleasant experience. It was often a gamble with one's health, and sometimes even with one's life. The murky liquid, brewed with questionable ingredients and often tampered with for profit, could easily cause severe stomach ailments, food poisoning, or worse. Yet, paradoxically, despite its risks, ale was still the safer choice compared to water. At that time, water, something we take for granted today, was a silent threat lurking in every well, stream, and pond, especially those near bustling settlements. These sources were frequently polluted with sewage, both human and animal, turning what should be life-giving into a source of disease and death. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera, these weren't rare afflictions but common killers, sweeping through communities with terrifying speed. To drink unboiled water was to invite misery, and everyone knew it. That's why even the youngest children, with their still growing bodies and delicate stomachs, were not given water, but small beer. A very low alcohol ale, weak enough to be safe, yet fermented just enough to kill harmful bacteria. It was not a luxury, but a necessity, a pragmatic solution to a harsh reality. This humble drink became a daily staple, helping stave off both illness and hunger, offering much-needed calories in a world where nourishment was scarce and meals were meager. Wine, in contrast, was a privilege. It flowed not from the cups of the poor, but from the goblets of nobles, wealthy merchants, and the clergy seated at the higher end of society. Imported from faraway regions, Bordeaux, Burgundy, the vineyards of Spain, or the slopes of the Rhine, Wine carried not just taste, but status. It was an indulgence, a symbol of wealth and refinement. But even here, illusion often replaced integrity. Some innkeepers, seeing an opportunity, would dilute wine with water, enhance its hue with berry juice, or blend leftover dregs from various barrels, then sell the concoction as something rare and refined. Deception knew no class. Such practices were so widespread that authorities appointed official ale tasters, aliconers, whose role was to ensure fair pricing and honest brewing. Yet in the isolated countryside, far from the eyes of the city, their presence was sporadic and their power limited. In truth, every time a traveler raised a cup to his lips in a medieval inn, he was rolling the dice. Each drink was a wager, each sip a small act of trust or desperation. And if the drinks were unpredictable, the food often left even more to be desired, especially for those who traveled on a tight purse. Forget the idea of rich stews or savory roasts. Meals served in these inns were rarely about pleasure. They were survival, nothing more. The food was coarse, basic, and brutally honest. The innkeeper's goal was to fill bellies, not delight palates. Bread stood at the center of the medieval diet, not the golden, fluffy loaves we imagine today, but dark, dense slabs made from rye, barley, or oats. Often mixed with bran, this bread was heavy and durable, but just as often, it was stale and tough, demanding strong jaws and little expectation. Wheat bread, light and soft, was a luxury reserved for the tables of the privileged, rarely making an appearance in the common inn unless for a wealthy guest with money to spend and status to show. In the end, a visit to a medieval inn was not about comfort, but about endurance. Every bite, every swallow was a reflection of the times, hard, uncertain, and unforgiving. Yet somehow, people endured. They drank, they ate, they survived, and in that perhaps lies the quiet resilience of the human spirit. Wheat, white bread, soft, airy, and delicate, was not merely food. It was a symbol of privilege, refinement, and elevated status. In the medieval world, where hunger was a daily companion for many, such bread was considered a true luxury, reserved for the tables of nobility and the wealthiest elite. For the average traveler seeking rest and sustenance at a roadside inn, it was a rare sight indeed. Only the most honored guests, those of stature, means, take, or reputation, might be served such a treat, and only if they were willing to pay handsomely for it. Hot food, when it was offered at all, came not in elegant courses, but in the form of a thick, humble broth or a simple stew, bubbling away in a large cauldron suspended over the open hearth. This common pot, a centerpiece of survival more than comfort, was filled with whatever could be gathered, foraged, or cheaply acquired from the market that day. Hardy root vegetables like turnips and parsnips, carrots and onions, beans and lentils, perhaps the occasional sprig of wild herbs or bitter roots dug from the surrounding forest. Meat, for the average inn traveler, was almost mythical in its rarity. When it did find its way into the pot, it was usually the least desirable cuts. Scraps and trimmings, offal and organs, bones and sinew. More often than not, it came from animals long past their prime, aged, ailing, or even already dead, bought for next to nothing and boiled to near oblivion. Occasionally, a more fortunate dish might include a bit of game, a rabbit or pheasant snared by the innkeeper or traded for by local poachers. And for those near the coast, rivers, or lakes, preserved fish, such as salted herring, dried eel, or smoked cod, might appear on the menu, though freshness was far from guaranteed. Indeed, spoilage was a grim reality, and many an innkeeper, driven by necessity or desperation, resorted to masking foul odors and spoiled flavors with strong spices or relentless overcooking. Vegetables were seasonal treasures, rare and fleeting, and during the long, bitter winters, they nearly vanished from tables altogether. What remained had been preserved through pickling, curing, smoking, or drying, methods that helped keep starvation at bay but often stripped the food of both taste and nourishment. Vitamins, as we understand them today, were scarce in such a diet. Nutrition was a matter of what could be kept alive, not what could sustain vitality. During years of failed harvests, brought on by floods, droughts, or sudden frosts, hunger turned into full-blown famine, and even the simplest dishes became luxuries. Prices soared, portions shrank, and the atmosphere in inns turned from mere hardship to quiet desperation. Innkeepers, too, were not immune to this struggle. They bore the burden of scarcity alongside their guests, fighting to keep their establishments open and their families fed. Often they had little more to offer than the barest essentials, sometimes not even that, and always at a cost that weighed heavily on both pocket and spirit. And yet in these modest meals and simple gatherings around the hearth, there was something profoundly human: resilience, hospitality, and the quiet dignity of making do. In every steaming bowl served with tired hands, in every morsel shared between strangers, there lived a story of survival, one that echoes through the centuries, reminding us how precious even the humblest food can be. Food poisoning was not a rare misfortune, it was an expected hazard. Travelers, already weary from the punishing road and drawn by the faint promise of shelter, would arrive at an inn hoping to ease their hunger and exhaustion. But instead of comfort, many were met with new trials. A hastily prepared meal, often made from stale, spoiled, or simply poor quality ingredients, could easily turn their respite into agony. What began as a simple stomachache could spiral into days of illness, or in some tragic cases, end their journey altogether. After such a meager supper, perhaps a bowl of thin stew, a hunk of dry bread, and a mug of ale that was more mystery than drink, the traveler's only wish was rest. Bone-tired from the road, with dust still clinging to their clothes and limbs, aching from days of riding or walking, they longed for sleep. But rest in a medieval inn was not the kind of rest we imagine today. There were no private rooms, no soft beds with clean sheets, and a door to close out the world. Especially for the average traveler or the poor, accommodations were communal, crowded, crude, and entirely devoid of comfort. The so-called Great Chamber, or common sleeping room, was usually a large, drafty hall, dimly lit by smoky tallow candles, where dozens of guests would lay wherever there was space. Straw mattresses, if they could be called that, were strewn across the wooden planks or the cold dirt floor. Stuffed with whatever was available, dry leaves, hay, or old straw, these makeshift beds were rarely aired out, never washed, and became perfect havens for pests. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs thrived in the warmth of unwashed bedding, feeding on the exhausted and defenseless bodies of travelers as they tossed and turned through the night. The soiled linens, if provided at all, were rough to the touch, yellowed with age and use. Thin blankets, patched and frayed, offered little warmth. Worse still, they were often shared, passed from one guest to another without the slightest pretense of hygiene. They held the sweat, smells, and sometimes even blood of previous occupants, leaving the new user to contend not only with discomfort, but with the very real threat of disease. Privacy was a luxury no one could afford. Men and women, young and old, strangers from different lands and with different tongues, slept shoulder to shoulder, pressed together for warmth. Some muttered prayers, others snored or whimpered in their sleep. The air was heavy with the mingled odors of bodies, damp wool, and fear. In this shared space, vulnerability was total, yet still they endured. For many, this rough shelter was better than the merciless cold of the open road. It was not comfort that they found in the inn, but a momentary pause, a fragile roof between themselves and the unforgiving world outside. And sometimes, even among the biting insects, the stale air, and the snoring of strangers, they found a few hours of uneasy sleep, enough perhaps to wake up and keep going. Personal space or privacy was out of the question. In the harsh, cramped reality of medieval inns, the idea of having a space to yourself, where you could breathe freely, rest undisturbed, or simply be alone with your thoughts, was a luxury no one could afford. People lay side by side, shoulder to shoulder, strangers bundled in tattered cloaks, sharing not just the floor or bed, but also their sweat, their coughs, and sometimes their fears. There was no hygiene to speak of in such conditions. Cleanliness, as we understand it today, was nearly non-existent. The very act of washing was reduced to a perfunctory splash of cold, often muddy water across the face, drawn from a shared basin tucked away in some dim corner. If you were lucky, the water wasn't entirely opaque. Soap, rare and precious, was more a symbol of privilege than a daily necessity. For the majority, the grime of the road, the smoke from the fire, and the sweat of unwashed bodies became an inseparable part of existence. In winter, all these charms were joined by a penetrating, bitter cold. The walls were thin, the floors uneven and drafty, and the doors barely held back the wind. Icy air seeped through every crack and crevice, gnawing at the bone. There was no hearth, no cozy fireplace to gather around in the sleeping quarters. Warmth, if it came at all, came from the press of other bodies, huddled in layers of old wool and whatever rags they could find. You didn't just sleep near others, you depended on them to survive the night. Not surprisingly, in such unsanitary and cold conditions, diseases ranging from the common cold, cough, and fever to more serious and dangerous infections such as typhoid, dysentery, or even leprosy and plague during epidemics spread easily and quickly. A single sneeze, a cough in the dark, and the illness could jump from person to person like wildfire. In such places, even a minor ailment could become a death sentence. The inn, a place meant for rest, could just as easily become a trap for the weary traveler whose strength was already failing. The inn could be a trap for a weakened traveler. It offered shelter, but not always safety. And while the walls might have kept out the wolves, they could not keep out the shadows of disease or danger that crept between the bodies and behind the eyes of strangers. Medieval inns were a melting pot of people from all walks of life, professions, and morals. Beneath their smoky, sagging roofs, you would find a chaotic orchestra of humanity. There were no filters, no gates, just a shared necessity. Nobles, beggars, warriors, traders, and wanderers alike sat side by side, each one with a story, each one hiding something. It was a stage where the sacred and the profane danced without separation, and where survival often depended not just on your strength, but on your instincts. Under their smoky and often leaky roofs, the most diverse and unpredictable public gathered, each with their own goals and fears. Some carried hope in their eyes, others carried secrets under their cloaks, and some carried nothing at all, just a hollow hunger for rest or redemption. And hopes. Yes, in the midst of the grime, the noise, and the uncertainty, there was always hope. A hope for warmth, for safety, for a better tomorrow, for one more sunrise. Tired travelers like our conditional hero sought here basic rest, food, and protection from the dangers of the night. And yet, in doing so, they exposed themselves to a whole new world of dangers, subtler, but no less deadly. They were the most numerous, but also the most vulnerable. Prey in a den full of predators with charming smiles and sharp eyes. Merchants carrying valuable goods, cloth, spices, metals, and more importantly, large sums of money, stayed overnight constantly on edge, fearing for the safety of their property and their lives. They clutched their purses even in sleep, half awake, always listening for a footstep too soft or a door that creaked open just a little too slowly. If they could, they hired guards. If not, they prayed, or drank, or both. Soldiers returning from war, going into royal service, or simply deserting were frequent and very troublesome visitors. Their boots stomped with arrogance, their eyes flickered with trauma, and their presence often turned the air thick with tension. They drank like men trying to drown ghosts, fought over anything and everything, and often refused to pay a coin, choosing instead to settle accounts with the weight of a sword or a fist. Pilgrims traveling to holy places in England or beyond also needed shelter and food. But even their spiritual quests didn't shield them from the harsh realities of the inn. They shared meals and straw beds with the broken and the lost, vagrants, beggars, cripples, and sometimes even criminals, thieves whose fingers never stopped moving, swindlers who smiled too much, and murderers who hid in plain sight, hoping no one looked too closely. In such a space, there was no separation between good and evil, between sinner and saint. Everyone was on a journey. Everyone had something to protect, or something to run from. In such a mixed and volatile crowd, where pilgrims, beggars, merchants, mercenaries, and fugitives often shared the same table and slept under the same roof, there existed an ever-present atmosphere of tension, distrust, and unease. Suspicion hung in the air like thick smoke. A single careless word, an unintended glance, a jostle in passing, or a heated disagreement over a game of dice could be all it took to ignite tempers. In an instant, voices would rise, fists would fly, and sometimes blood would spill. Knives were drawn, daggers flashed, or a heavy tankard could become a deadly weapon in the heat of the moment. Robbery, too, was not some rare occurrence. It was an expected risk. Especially after sunset, when shadows deepened and drunkenness dulled the senses, danger became a silent companion. A weary traveler could be drugged, stripped of his coin while he slept, or ambushed in a secluded corner of the courtyard. No one could be fully trusted, and the notion of safety within the walls of the inn was fragile at best, more illusion than reality. Amid this chaotic backdrop stood the innkeeper, a figure both central and conflicted. He wasn't just the host offering food and lodging. He was also, by necessity, a psychologist with a sharp eye, a peacemaker with quick reflexes, and sometimes even a bouncer ready to step into the fray. He knew his regular patrons not just by name, but by gesture, tone, and rumor. He had memorized their tendencies: the quiet merchant with a hidden purse, the soldier with a short fuse, the gambler with debts and dangerous friends. The inn itself often became more than just a rest stop. It was a kind of living bulletin board for the region. Within its smoky rooms and crowded benches, news traveled fast. Updates on political tensions, movement of armies, rumors of rebellion, market prices, missing persons, unsolved crimes. Words whispered over ale could change lives and sometimes entire fates. Conspiracies were born between sips of wine. Deals, both noble and nefarious, were struck in the dark corners. The innkeeper, whether he liked it or not, became a vital node in the web of local knowledge and power. He might be recruited as a source by spies, questioned by the authorities, or discreetly warned by criminals seeking to protect their own. And if life at the inn was treacherous in times of peace, then during times of war, it became nearly unbearable. Feudal conflicts, peasant revolts, and the constant shifts in power turned the inn into a battlefield of a different kind. Nobles commandeered rooms, soldiers looted supplies, uprisings turned guests into enemies overnight. The walls meant for shelter echoed with fear and unpredictability. The medieval inn, far from the romantic ideal we sometimes imagine, was a raw and ruthless stage where survival demanded cunning, strength, and resilience from both the travelers who passed through and the innkeeper who stood watch. Now picture this. The inn, already a fragile haven in peaceful times, became something far more dangerous when war came creeping across the countryside. Warring parties, whether royal forces, rebellious peasants, or noble-led militias, descended on inns not with respect but with hunger, urgency, and absolute disregard. These places were seized without ceremony, transformed overnight into barracks for exhausted soldiers, and, just as often, into crude field hospitals for the wounded. But there were no clean linens, no trained medics, only the groans of the dying, the bloodstains that soaked into the wood, and the overwhelming stench of infection and despair. It didn't end there. In many cases, these once humble inns bore witness to darker uses. The back room became a place of forced confessions, the cellar a site of interrogation, torture, even execution. Chains replaced tankards, screams replaced songs. And the innkeeper, he stood at the center of it all, trapped between duty and destruction. He and his family lived each day under threat, caught in a deadly tension. To refuse soldiers food, firewood, or shelter was to risk losing everything: his inn, his health, even his life. But the moment he served one army, he became a traitor to the next. The shifting tides of power meant that today's protector could become tomorrow's executioner. There was no safety, only a constant gamble, only survival. Looting was not a possibility, it was a certainty. Soldiers, long unpaid and starved of discipline, turned on the very people they claimed to protect. They took what they wanted: livestock, grain, valuables. They stole dignity, they desecrated sanctuaries. They left behind broken doors, broken homes, broken lives. And the inn, so often seen as a place of gathering, warmth, and rest, was among the first to fall victim. Its shelves raided, its ale drained, its hidden corners searched. The innkeeper's only hope? To hide what mattered most and pray. Pray the next knock wasn't the last. History remembers this, not in legends, but in scars. During the chaos of King Stephen's reign, a time of lawlessness and bloodshed known only as the Anarchy, inns across England were torn apart. In the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when commoners rose in fiery defiance, inns served as meeting points, as safe houses, as battlegrounds. And during the long, brutal War of the Roses, when cousin fought cousin for England's crown, many an innkeeper found himself hosting more than travelers. He hosted fate itself. Behind closed doors and candlelit rooms, secret alliances were born. Old enemies met with hushed voices. Kings were betrayed with a single overheard word. The fate of battles turned on what was said or not said within those walls. And in all of it, the innkeeper remained the silent witness. Sometimes protector, sometimes pawn, sometimes the unexpected player who, with one act of loyalty or one act of betrayal, shifted the course of history. For example, during the Wars of the Roses, when England was violently torn between the rival claims of the houses of Lancaster and York, inns were far more than places of rest. They became the shadowy crossroads of intrigue and power, doubling as secret headquarters, discreet meeting points, and hiding places for spies, rebels, and noble loyalists. In these dimly lit rooms, plans were whispered that would shape the fates of cities, armies, and perhaps even the crown itself. The innkeeper, far from being a neutral bystander, often held the power to decide who could safely pass through and who might vanish without a trace. His choices, whether made out of loyalty, fear, or profit, could tilt the delicate balance of a local conflict or doom his entire household. To survive in such bloody and volatile times, he had to possess a sharp mind, an unshakable calm, a talent for discretion, and more than a little luck. The Middle Ages was not just the age of knights in gleaming armor, heroic crusades, or soaring cathedrals. Beneath the grandeur lay a darker, more grueling truth. It was an age of relentless human struggle against both man-made turmoil and the brutal indifference of nature. And nowhere was this more vividly reflected than in the humble, battered inn, a mirror to the era's harshest realities. Long, bitter winters were among the cruelest trials faced by both commoners and innkeepers alike. Europe was gripped by what modern historians call the Little Ice Age, beginning in the 14th century, a period marked by significant climate cooling, unseasonably harsh weather, and prolonged winters. These colder seasons didn't just bite at the skin, they gnawed away at survival itself. Firewood, the lifeblood of warmth and cooking, grew scarce. The innkeeper had to scour the woods, barter with locals, or ration supplies just to keep a single hearth lit. His buildings, often thrown together from timber and mud, poorly insulated and no match for the cutting winds, became iceboxes. Travelers huddled in their cloaks, shivering beside smoldering embers, suffering just as much from the cold as from hunger. And hunger came often. Famine was a frequent and unwelcome guest at every table. A single failed harvest, brought on by drought, excessive rain, early frosts, or the ravages of locusts, could tip entire regions into crisis. Food stores vanished, markets dried up, and prices surged beyond what most people could afford. Inns, which relied on those same markets, were hit hard. Their menus shrank drastically, offering little more than thin broth, stale scraps, or whatever bitter greens could be foraged from the frozen earth. In those bleak years, even a small crust of coarse bread or a ladle of watery stew made from nettles and turnip tops could seem like a feast. For many, it was more than food. It was a sign of life, of hope, of one more night survived. And for the innkeeper, each day was a negotiation with scarcity. Each night a battle against cold, hunger, and the desperation that hung thick in the air. He didn't just run a business, he held a fragile line between civilization and collapse. Desperate, starving people left behind the ashes of their homes and wandered toward the towns, trudging along muddy roads and frostbitten fields in search of something, anything to keep them alive. For many, the inn was not just a place to rest, but their last hope, a faint light in a dark and crumbling world. And yet, that hope often proved hollow. The fires burned, the doors opened, but inside there was little more than shadow, danger, and desperation. Perhaps no force shaped the medieval world more brutally than disease. It struck without warning and without mercy. Epidemics of smallpox, typhus, dysentery, leprosy, and influenza rolled through towns like tidal waves of suffering and left behind silence. They came often, too often, leveling entire communities, turning once bustling villages into ghostly remnants of grief. But nothing compared to the Black Death. In the middle of the 14th century, the plague arrived like a monstrous specter sweeping across Europe in a black, choking tide. Bubonic and pneumonic, it spread from ports to peaks, infecting the poor and the powerful alike. In just a few short years, a third to half of the continent's population vanished. Cities collapsed under the weight of corpses, fields went unharvested, orphans wandered through empty streets, entire families disappeared in a matter of days. And at the heart of it all, helpless and exposed, stood the inns, cramped, filthy, and overrun with rats and fleas, the perfect vectors for disease. These establishments became unintentional incubators of contagion. Illness clung to every surface, passed from hand to hand, cup to cup, and breath to breath. In times of plague, people either barricaded themselves in fear, avoiding all contact with the outside world, or they fled their homes, feverish and dying, collapsing in doorways and ditches, seeking shelter in the only places still open to them. Inns became tombs with a roof. The innkeeper, that solitary figure behind the bar or by the fire, bore witness to all of it. He saw death not as a stranger, but as a daily visitor. He held trembling hands as people gasped their final words. He offered the last bowl of broth, the last prayer, the last shred of human dignity to guests he would later bury in hurried, unmarked graves behind the building, and yet somehow he kept going. It is time now to look more closely at this figure, the innkeeper, not as a background character in history, but as a symbol of quiet endurance in the face of unimaginable hardship. He was no caricature, no jolly host from a storybook. He was complex, forged in fire, weathered by fear and fatigue. The man behind the inn was not merely serving ale, he was surviving. Later centuries, with the comfort of distance, would romanticize him. Paintings would show a round-bellied man, apron tied tight, laughter in his eyes, always ready with a story or a song. But that cheerful illusion would have been unrecognizable to the real innkeepers of the plague years. They didn't laugh much, they didn't rest easy. They lived at the edge of ruin, always one cough, one coin, one conflict away from losing everything. And still they opened their doors, because even when death walked through them, so did life. In the harsh, unvarnished reality of medieval life, the innkeeper stood as a symbol not of comfort and cheer, but of raw resilience and unrelenting grit. He was, in every sense of the word, a master of survival. His job demanded far more than business sense. It required a complex arsenal of skills, instincts, and inner strength. To run an inn successfully was not simply a matter of pouring drinks and collecting coins. It was a matter of endurance, vigilance, and often personal risk. It was not a calling for the faint of heart or the weak of will. Each day presented a fresh gauntlet of challenges. The innkeeper navigated a world where dishonesty lurked behind every transaction. Beer suppliers would stretch their profits by watering down the ale or delivering barrels of sour brew. Food vendors offered meat that had turned, flour infested with worms, or produce already rotting from within. Nothing could be taken at face value. The innkeeper had to develop a discerning eye and a deep well of suspicion, not out of choice, but necessity. And then there were the guests. Travelers of all kinds passed through his doors: merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, beggars, thieves, and with them came unpredictability, tension, and often violence. Many arrived already drunk, emboldened by ale and fatigue. The innkeeper had to know when to smile, when to intervene, when to quietly move aside, and when to step in with force. He was a negotiator, a bouncer, a peacekeeper, and at times a fighter. There were no guarantees. Even an attempt to restore order could end in blood. A knife concealed in a sleeve, a bottle broken in a fist, one misstep could be his last. But the threats didn't end at the door. Beyond the rowdy guests and spoiled supplies, more insidious dangers loomed. Corrupt local officials might appear under the guise of inspections or tax collection, demanding bribes or inventing infractions. Bandits from the forests, men hardened by lawlessness, might arrive in the dead of night, demanding payment for protection or simply looting the inn outright. The innkeeper lived on edge, always watching, always calculating, never truly at rest. To survive in such a world, he needed to read people like books, quickly, accurately, and often without a single word exchanged. He had to sense trouble before it sparked, notice who entered with hungry eyes or a clenched jaw, and know instinctively which table might erupt into violence. He walked a constant tightrope, mediating between rival factions, navigating tense alliances, and keeping just enough distance to avoid becoming a target himself. His greatest strength was perhaps not his fists or his income, but his diplomacy, his ability to belong everywhere and nowhere at once. And none of this could be done alone. Often, the innkeeper was supported, if not outright saved, by his wife. She was the silent engine of the establishment, stirring pots in the smoky kitchen, scrubbing what could be scrubbed, mending linens, and tending to guests with patience sharpened by necessity. Many times, especially when war took men away or death arrived uninvited, it was the alewife who took the reins, running the business, defending the threshold debt, making hard decisions with no one to consult but her own instincts. The legacy of these innkeepers, both men and women, lives on in the pages of court records and dusty chronicles. Some are remembered as generous hosts, pillars of their community who fed the hungry and offered shelter in dark times. Others appear as cautionary tales, greedy, cruel, and corrupt, stopping at nothing to turn a profit, whether through deception, exploitation, or worse. Between those extremes, most simply endured, doing whatever it took to keep their doors open one more night. It was never just a job, it was survival, carved into the bones. That included deception, cheating, watering down drinks, and sometimes even being involved in robberies or murders of their guests. The line between hospitality and exploitation was often blurred, and many innkeepers walked it with practiced ease or sheer desperation. Some were honest, trying to survive in an unforgiving world. Others were ruthless opportunists, unafraid to profit from the vulnerability of those who had nowhere else to go. The legal status of innkeepers and the taxes they were required to pay to the crown or the local feudal lord varied depending on the time and location. In some regions, they were granted licenses and operated under strict regulations. In others, their existence was barely acknowledged by the law, except when tax collectors came knocking or a crime had been committed under their roof. But regardless of official recognition, they were always under pressure from authorities, from criminals, from guests, and from the sheer demands of the trade. But one thing remained unchanged. It was hard, responsible, and very dangerous work that demanded constant physical and mental effort. Running an inn was no romantic pursuit. It was a grueling occupation that left little room for error. The innkeeper had to be everything at once: a cook, a cleaner, a mediator, a guard, a businessman, and sometimes even a healer or priest. One bad judgment could cost him not just his livelihood, but his life. So, we have pulled back the heavy veil of time and tried to look at a medieval English inn without romantic filters or later embellishments. We've stripped away the nostalgia, the warm candlelight, the songs of wandering minstrels, and the cheerful toasts at the hearth. What remains is raw, real, and often uncomfortable, a window into the gritty reality of a world we too often sanitize in our imaginations. It was by no means a place from the merry tales of Robin Hood or the chivalric novels about King Arthur. It was not a sanctuary of joy and revelry, but a microcosm of a society grappling with hunger, disease, violence, and relentless uncertainty. Far from the ideals of knightly honor or merry adventure, it was a survival ground where everyone, from the innocent to the guilty, played their part. It was a harsh, dangerous, dirty, and extremely uncomfortable refuge, reflecting all the enormous hardships and relentless deprivations of that brutal era. And yet, within its smoky walls, stories were shared, deals were struck, secrets whispered, and lives forever changed. It was not beautiful, but it was undeniably human. The inn was a place where all kinds of people crossed paths, from a pious pilgrim to a hardened criminal, from a wealthy merchant to a poor vagabond. Every face told a story, every night brought new dangers, and every day was uncertain. But that was the nature of the road, and the reality of those who dared to shelter those walking it. It was a place where every day was a struggle for survival, both for the road-weary traveler and for the innkeeper himself, constantly balancing between risk and necessity. There was no glamour in it, only grit. And perhaps that, more than anything else, is what makes it worth remembering.